up to $10,000. You raise 10,000, I'm gonna donate 20. It's gonna give you 30,000. 15,000 will go to Elisha Green, and 15,000 go to AED. So it's really a fantastic.
Well, that is a great thing. Besides this book, he's written some other interesting history books. We were just talking about this one. You pronounce it Ardelia or?
I call her Delia.
Delia Webster and the Underground Railroad. And I just purchased this one.
Forever
Bell.
About Sally Ward, who was a scandalous, fashionable lady in 19th century Kentucky.
And this one's very interesting. Mary Todd Lincoln, Henry Clay, and the immigrant family who educated Annabelle, Kentucky. And they call them pronounce this one, Mantellis?
Just Mantel.
Mantel, okay. All right, I'm not doing too good on my pronunciation. Anyway, all the books are excellent, and thank you so much for coming. And would you read this?
Thank you all for coming. We talked to you about Elisha Green. Elisha Green, born 1818, close to Centerville, Kentucky, which is between Paris and Frankfurt on 460. And it's called Centerville because it's halfway between Cynthiana and Lexington, and I guess Paris and Frankfurt. And he was born a slave. And he doesn't know his birthday because the book in which his birth dates were recorded was in the fire, but at least he knew it was 1818 because at the age of 10, people in his family that owned him, his owner died, and so the property was somewhat distributed to other relatives, but also put on the auction block. And he, at the age of 10, in 1828, was put on the auction block over here in front of the courthouse in Washington. And he talks about that because he wrote the autobiography of his life, which of course was great help to me in writing his biography. And this is what he said. The reason was what I said, but I'm going to quote him too. The reason 10-year-old Elisha was brought from Bourbon to Mason County in 1828 was that Charles Dobbins, one of Edward's sons, had died in February that year, and to settle the estate of slaves, one of whom was Elisha, had to be sold. Auction was held July 21st, 1828, on the lawn of the Washington, Kentucky courthouse, where Harry Beecher, who was not yet Stowe, in the summer of 1833, would see another slave action that impelled her to write on Tom's Cabin. And she had been brought by one of her students, right, in Cincinnati to visit, and so she stayed in this house where we
It's
are.
actually the daughter that lived here
The daughter.
invited her to come, and she was staying here.
The result of that auction, and I list the names, and I'm careful to include the first one because it's a relative of mine, sold to Asa R. Runyon, a man, Harry, $382. Now he's not a direct forebearer, but he's like a cousin or something of a direct forebearer. My Runyon people were in this area from maybe 1800 or 1802. And I won't list all the ones, of course, it'd be silly. But one interesting thing that there were 7 slaves, and an 8th one was on the pre-sale inventory, but was not in the sale. Why do you think that was? A notation in March of the following year explains why. Quote, the man, Joseph, ran away before the sale of said estate. perhaps a traveler on the Underground Railroad that ran through John Rankin's house on the hill above Ripley, Ohio, 10 miles down the river from Maysville. It's possible, I do not know who Elisha Green's father was, but that could have been his father, or could have easily have been an uncle. The event of the auction was seared into Elisha Green's memory. He writes, "My sister and her 4 children and myself were sold in Washington. When we were put up to be sold, Mr. Oliver Cale, K-A-L-E, refused to cry us off, that is to call the auction, to auction, and a man by the name of Charlie Ward supplied the place. This act of," still quoting Elisha Green, "this act of selling black people was considered by many as being of low character, while there were those who thought it right, and to sell a black person was nothing more than selling a mule." So this is Elisha Green talking about his own experience. Another Washington connection is that it's a little confusing to me, but I have to accept how the situation was. Although he was put up for auction, he wound up in the Dobbins family where he began, just with different Dobbins. And it was an older woman in the family who then lent Elisha, young 10-year-old Elisha, to her son, who lived in Maysville and had a warehouse. He sold farm produce, which was brought to him from the county, and I'm thinking it might have been a lower market, but I don't know. Elisha had certain duties but left him a little free time. His duties were not those of an agricultural slave on a farm, because that's not where he was, but in a place of business. He learned how to do arithmetic because he was supposed to weigh on scales, grain, or count the bushels, or figure that out. So he knew arithmetic from that. In the evening, he lived above on an upper floor in his warehouse and spent his time by candlelight learning how to read by reading the Bible through a few times. The family that had borrowed him from the other owner, who was still in the family, had a daughter who, at the age of 8, about that time, the father, Mr. Dobbins, built the Octagon House on the Fleming Road, I think, which is a fabulous piece of architecture. And so he lived there. And Elisha Green lived in slave quarters behind the house. And this 8-year-old girl taught him how to read. Oh, I'm sorry. He knew how to read. Taught him how to write. And he was very proud he could write a letter to his brother who was off in Missouri as a slave. I wanted to read this other passage, and that is that he was married eventually to a slave woman, Elisha was, who lived in Mays Lake, I think, or beyond Mays Lake. And he could visit her on weekends, as long as he walked. And let me find here. To visit his family, because he had children by then too, he would take the stagecoach to Mays Lick from Maysville on a Saturday. But because it did not run on Sunday, he had to walk the 13 miles back. So whatever 13 miles is out of Maysville to or beyond Mays Lick, that's where he had to go or come back from. He always carried a pair of saddle pockets in which he brought items for his wife and children. Several times when returning on foot, he was stopped in Washington as a suspected runaway because he was headed toward Maysville, where many fugitives crossed the river to freedom. A slave trader asked him where he was going. Green said he had just come from visiting his wife. The slave trader asked who she belonged to, and he told him. Then the trader, quote, said he had a great mind to put me in jail. Green replied that was fine with him, because he was so tired from walking, he needed a rest and would be glad to sleep in the Washington jail while the word was sent to Mr. Dobbins in Maysville. He earned the money to buy the items that he gave his kids and his wife because he was very enterprising, and he could do little extra jobs, say at the warehouse. For example, he got rid of a rat infestation. It was not his duty, but he did it, and so he was paid for it, like so much per rat. On another occasion, he realized that there had been a barrel of lard, or bacon fat, that had leaked out and was all over the floor in a certain room of the warehouse. And he devised a way to get it up. I forget what it was, but it involved a tea kettle and application of heat, and he presented or sold the tallow or whatever that was to someone, and with the money he bought a set of silver spoons. So he was a very enterprising fellow. He also earned money as a preacher because he was a Baptist, and at that time the African American members of the Baptist Church in Basilic, but also in Washington, worshiped with the white folks, but perhaps in the balcony. I certainly remember hearing the tale told to me of the Presbyterian Church in Maysville at the balcony, which is a dangerous place to sit because there's no railing and it slopes steeply. But there's balconies on either side. That was where the slaves sat. That church was built, around 1851, I think, or so. But he was really fascinated by seeing preachers at the Baptist Church in Maysville, the one on the site where on Market Street, there is one now, but that was not the same building, I believe. I think I might have gotten a little bit wrong. The black church had their own church behind that church, a wooden structure. They were somewhat under the umbrella of the white church. Eventually they founded their own church. They rented a building, which alas is gone, but that's where the statue will go, I hope, is that on the, we call that the Lexington Road, or the...
Used to be called.
Yeah. And I know right where it is. And they bought furniture for it, but they rented the building. Ultimately, they were able to buy the building. And unfortunately, it burned in 1970 something, I think. He became the preacher for that church. Bethel Baptist, I think they call it, right? Which still exists, and I think they hold services in what was the Forest Avenue School, where I attended 5th grade. He was invited in 1855 or so to preach at the Black Baptist Church in Paris, and he actually held both pulpits and would alternate weekends. And he would take a stagecoach in the beginning, before the train was ready, up to Paris. And in 1883, he was taking the train, which was then in action. And when the train got to Millersburg, 8 miles away from Paris, it stopped and picked up about 40 people, about 37 of whom were young ladies from the Millersburg Female Academy, that was not, which is between, I think, 8th and 9th Street, is where there's a public housing place. In Millersburg, it's not to be confused with MMI or Western Hills. It wasn't by there. And it was run by a man from North Carolina named George Gould, who had been, in 1871-72, minister of the Methodist Church, Southern Methodist, as opposed to, the slaveholding Methodist Church. The Methodist split on slavery as the Baptists had, which was located next to the Washington Theater in Maysville. You know where that is? It's where in 1953 or so I stood in a cold day in January and watched Rosemary Clooney parade by for the opening of The Stars Are Singing, which I later saw on YouTube, and it's not bad. I mean, it's not the Ten Commandments, but it's, anyway, he thought he'd have an easier time with George Gould if he became the president of this institution of learning, which had already been around for like 10 years. It's more of a steady job. If you're a Methodist preacher, you never know where your next meal is coming from, I think he thought. Besides, he had a little problem with alcohol and with women. Well, women were easy for him, but because he picked on slaves. I don't want to get too much into the story, but in my book I tell the whole story of his life and that of another character who was the music professor at that institution for Millersburg Female Academy. And so Gould and the music professor, along with about 38 young ladies, got on the train in Paris. And when they saw this black man sitting in the front row of his car, they thought, well, we don't like this. Let's make him leave. But they were not very nice about it. He said later, Elisha said, if they'd asked me nicely, I might have moved to the next car. But they tried to pull him out of his seat. He resisted, and he was, 6 feet tall, and he was very strong. And so they couldn't pull him out. So then the music professor tried swinging his briefcase at him. It had some brass fittings on it, so it cut his face. He was bleeding. The conductor came up and said, if you two gentlemen from Millersburg don't stop that, I'm going to throw you off the train right now. And so Elisha was saved. But a third person, who was the secretary, a young man of Gould, had a gun in his hip pocket, and he pulled back his coat to show it while they were struggling with Elisha Green. Said, I might shoot you if you don't stop resisting. So he showed some, courage then. And a man whose father was the minister of the Presbyterian Church in Maysville, and who later in the 1890s took that position, was on the train, and he knew Elisha Green from Maysville. And he said, as they were walking off the train, he said, you can have legal recourse. And so he went to see a lawyer, and he had legal recourse, and he sued for assault. That's why the title of the book is The Assault on Elisha Green. The two perpetrators, 3, and actually won. But he didn't get the $1,000 he asked for. He only got $25, but that's still about $750 these days. So it was kind of a civil rights victory for public transportation rights. Certainly the trains at that time, 1882, were not segregated. There were various articles in the paper that followed up on this episode talking about whites and blacks sitting together, or at least in the same car, if not the same row. That didn't come until 1890s when Kentucky decided, well, I guess we're part of the South after all. Let's do what Alabama and Mississippi do. Let's segregate our trains. But it was not the case, at the time Elisha Green bought pay for his ticket. At an earlier time, let me say that he earned money on the side. I told you how he did that. You preached funerals, you get money for that. Back in slavery times, he would be given a financial recompense by the white owners of the slaves for whose funeral he preached. He caught rats and gave raw material for making candles and other things of that nature. And he earned enough money to buy his sister's freedom, and which was like $300, $400, or $500 times 30 in today's money, and his mother's freedom, and then finally his own. And that of most of his children. And there was one of his sons, however, whose freedom he could not buy, not because he didn't have the money or couldn't raise it, but his owner refused to give him up and sold to the South. But all the other owners, were okay with selling their slaves to him, and then that's how he got the freedom. However, he had to borrow money to do this. And there was a group of 13 men, white men, from Maysville, who got together and decided to underwrite his loan. And they did that, and they told him, you don't have to pay it back. He said, no, I will pay it back, and he did. It took him maybe 8 or 10 years, but he didn't pay it back. But it was an interesting act of civic virtue, generosity on the part of these white Maysvilleans to know him so well, because he was greatly beloved and respected in Maysville, to do that for him. Let me see, what else would I talk about? He gave political speeches after the Civil War. Not a lot, but a few. He ran as an elector. You don't elect the president by a popular vote. You didn't think. And so you run as elector. So he was a Republican, not a Democrat. Democrats were the conservative party, the slave owner party at that time. And so he would give a speech. He was very good at giving speeches. Now, let me think. Oh, yes. He had bought his freedom by the time of the anecdote I'm about to tell. He was traveling by stagecoach from Lexington to Maysville. And at Millersburg, or at Blue Licks, there had been a flood in what's the South Fork of the Licking River, but down the valley, down the hill from the park. So the carriage had to stop and everyone would get out. They would get the carriage up the hill, but it was all muddy and everything. Anyway, so he had to walk a little bit along with all the other passengers. And he was picked on by a white man who was trying to do violence to him, and he pushed him down the hill. And everyone else in the carriage said, "Bravo!" That's the way to do it. I'm trying to think of the other. There might not be that many other anecdotes that I want to tell. But do you know Paris at all? I'm sure you do. The train station is still there, and it's a restaurant. And that's where he got off the train and was told, you can have legal recourse. And he walked up the hill to the courthouse where there was a lawyer's office. And that happened, that was 1883. I want to tell you a little bit about my other books because they happen to be here. There are Maysville connections to these two. Actually a Washington connection. Charlotte and Valdemar Mentel, born in the 1760s, 1770s in Paris, France, who came to America, were part of the French colony in Gallipolis, Ohio, which is near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which was Virginia then. We've got 500 French colonists who lived there. So they lived there, and then they left and lived in Washington here for a couple of years. And they, I don't know where, but not in town, probably on a farm. And they raised vegetable produce and they sold it. And they then moved to Lexington in 1795, where they tried various ways of making money. And in the end, she opened a school in about 1820, and it was called Mentel's for Young Ladies. And Mary Todd was one of her students, certainly her private student. The classes were in French, and they put on French plays, Moliere, Racine, Vernet. So it was a higher educational level than what you would find in Lexington today, or maybe not. I don't know. I shouldn't say that.
That's all right.
It's certainly higher than, the Maysville High School play was in English. And Mary Todd, that's why it wasn't not my idea, but that's why the publisher, UK Press, put a subtitle on it. Mary Todd Lincoln Henry Clay, the immigrant family who was educated at Belleville, Kentucky, gross, etc. They did not educate all of them. But they were great friends with him. They played across the street from him. Then there is this, which the connection to Maysville. Come on in. Yeah, come on. Great. Delia Webster was from Vermont, and she taught school. She went to Oberlin, but was kicked out for some reason, and maybe didn't meet the standard. And taught school in Lexington in 1843, 44, and with the assistance of a man named Calvin Fairbank, who was an itinerant preacher of the Methodist variety, who was quite active in the Underground Railroad. Together, they rescued a family from Lexington, and they drove on the road that I came on today, from Millersburg, Washington. And they stopped in Washington for a few hours to rest. And they had a long discussion with the innkeeper, whose name was Mr. Music, M-U-S-I-C-K. And I don't know where that was. I later was poking around in the cemetery over across the road, and I found Delia Music. Strange, the same name that she had. And of course, the last one probably the daughter of the innkeeper, because she died young. And they were pretending, Calvin Fairbank and Delia Webster, pretending to be a runaway couple. That is, they had the Hayden family, Louis Hayden, his wife Harriet, and her son Joe, hidden in the carriage. But they came in and talked, and they pretended to excuse what they were driving into the night for. They weren't rescuing slaves. They were running off to get married. Of course, there was a well-known person, I don't know as early as that in Aberdeen, who was a justice of the peace who married runaway couples for decades. Little local history there to investigate. But of course, that was not the case. They were not running away to get married. But then they continued the next morning down to Maysville, and or she stayed in Washington, but Calvin, with the people to be rescued, took a ferry across to Aberdeen and out to Ripley, and then out to the Underground Railroad. But then they had to go back to return the carriage they had rented and the rocker, who was a slave. And when they returned to Lexington, they were captured. They were imprisoned because by then the absence of the slave was known. And then they had their trial. They had separate trials. She had hers in December of 44, and she was found guilty and sentenced to a period, I forget how long, in the penitentiary in Frankfurt. And he later was too. He served like 14 years, and she got off after a few weeks because there was an agitation to present a petition to the governor to pardon her because she was a woman. And women couldn't possibly have done what she did, so it must have been a mistake. And she maintained her innocence in the trial, anyway. The prison keeper, what we call the warden, was Newton Craig, a famous Craig Baptist family in Scott County, who later, or in fact he, peddled the myth that they had invented bourbon. But I don't think they did. But who knows? No one knows the origin of bourbon. That's for another day. And they became quite good friends. And he fell in love with her. While the month or so she was in prison, he sent his children to be tutored by her. She went home to Vermont, and then she returned in a year and lived in his house, which is a beautiful Italianate house on the road, the Frankfurt Road, between Georgetown and Frankfurt. It's on the right as you go west. House is still there. And he wrote her a letter saying, when she left to go live in Madison, Indiana, I think my wife is going to die soon. She's ill, and I want to marry you. And she said no. And then this is in 1854, so it's 10 years after the events that I was telling. And he tried to come over and capture her, take her back on some trumped up charge dating from 1844. She had a big trial on the 4th of July, 1854 in Madison. She had an able lawyer who defended her and prevented her from having to go back to Kentucky. But once I get into like an historical event where there's some nobility, as in Korean slave, rescuing someone, I always like to then follow where else I can go. There's always some romantic attachment or scandal that I also follow. So that's in this, and certainly in this, which I'm afraid I've sold all my copies, but I have this one left. But this is my notes book, and it's called Forever Belle, Sally Ward of Kentucky, born in 1827 in Scott County. In 1838, moved to Louisville. Her father was immensely rich. He was in the cotton trade. He had plantations in Mississippi and Arkansas. And I don't want to get too close into it, but she smoked cigars and walked with a cane because the French novelist George Sand did her song. So she started, she was an influencer. So all the other young ladies of a certain high social class would do that in Louisville too for a while in the 1840s. She had 4 husbands sequentially, and only the second was happy for her. But I'm getting way far from where I started, which was the story of Elisha Green. But Elisha Green was a figure of great nobility, whose life I think is worth studying. And there's finally my last guest here. This is my spouse.
I've heard of it before.
She's heard it before. She didn't want to hear it. So maybe it's question and answer time. If you have any answers, I have questions. No, if you have any questions,
Did his mother get her freedom before he did?
yes, he bought his mother's freedom, right? And he had to use his mother as a go-between to get his own, because you couldn't buy your own.
Interesting, yeah, so then when he was
So like,
getting
she
his own-
technically owed him it, and then,
Yeah,
like he gave her the money, and then, right. And then she gave the money to whoever was the owner.
Elisha Green's wife was Susan Young.
Yes.
Is there any connection between Susan Young and Charles Young? They were both raised as slaves in Maryland.
I never thought of that till you started asking that question. I said, oh my God, there's Charles Young. Could be. Could well
I never
be.
thought of that.
They'd be about the same age, brother and sister on the same arm when they live.
Yeah. Well, we gotta find out.
You
Let us know what you find out.
Well, let me know when you find out too. Well, that is wonderful. Yeah. I was seeing it more likely than not.
And he lived, Charles lived about a mile or 2 miles outside of Maysville. And as your speech said, she lived 2 or 3 miles outside of there.
Right.
No, they could be connected there.
Right. And I know the name is in my book of who owned her. I wonder if it's the same name as who owned his family.
Could be.
Yeah. But that would be one track to follow.
You know, I mean, his name was Green. You know where that came from? I mean, it wouldn't have been an African name, would it? So,
What, Green?
where his family name, where he picked up his family name, the origin of his family name?
I always assumed, I just couldn't find the actual evidence that his family, before he was born, the family that owned him was named Green.
Okay.
And it's such a common name, I couldn't find for certain a Green. I think I did find a judge named Green in Rural County. I don't know. But it's interesting, by the way, this is maybe something that I meant to touch on slightly. His own name, he was given the name Elisha. And Elisha is the prophet who comes after Elijah. And Elijah put the mantle on Elisha when God told him to do it. You know, Elijah was getting old and says, I want to retire or kick the bucket. And God said, okay, I need a successor. And God said, okay, go out and look in the field. You see that young man in the field working. He'll be your successor. And put the mantle, literal cloak or whatever, on him. And I might be a little wrong with the details, but I think it's basic to the story. And it struck me as interesting that Elisha Green, in his autobiography, talks of the fact that he was out working in a field as a slave, very young, when he was suddenly converted. It's like God, came onto him. And I think he knew the biblical narrative of Elisha and Elijah. Naturally, if he's reading the Bible, he would find his name. He said, oh, this is interesting. And so he kind of absorbed that. It's not just coincidence, I imagine.
What about his name connected with starting the theological college in Louisville?
Yeah, Simmons. It's Simmons College now, I think.
He started in Louisville.
Yeah, it's in Louisville. Yeah. I think I saw a sign for it near U of L when I was there the other day. On his autobiography, he's very proudly saying founder of, or co-founder of, the Louisville Theological Institute, or it had a different name then, but it was a seminary for Black Baptist preachers. Yeah.
I think he's an interesting character. The statue would be something this community needs to support,
Yes.
because, like I told you before, he's our Martin Luther King. He was an advocate for justice for Negroes when they didn't have any justice.
Right.
And he's also was a Rosa Parks that rode and didn't have to get up. They didn't like
Very much in that.
Yes.
He didn't like the word nigger, but he liked the Negroes. So,
Right.
Right.
and the community, those 13 people, seen the good in the man. So,
Yeah.
I think it's pretty amazing with all the churches he went to and
And he
all
founded
the
a
other
number of
odd
churches.
jobs he did to gain pay for everybody's freedom.
How old was he when he died, and did he always live in Maysville?
Very good.
Yeah, I had a stone cleaned off a couple of years ago. I had a stone cleaned off a couple of years ago. I mean, you know, you ask the cemetery board, will they do that? Yeah. So it's down by the railroad tracks, within the Maysville Cemetery. He was born in 1918. I think he died in 1893.
Okay.
So he would have been, what, 75 or
75,
Yeah. And of course, when he died, it was there were huge crowds at the funeral, and he was held here. Despite his parents, they couldn't hold it in both places, but people from Paris came.
And he had a lot of prominent preachers from all over the world preaching this. E.D. Du Bois preached there, and letters to him. And amazing fellow.
Yes. Well, thanks for listening, and I'm so moved that you are working on raising money for this statue. We really need that.
It'll tell a nice story.
Yes,
It's worthy to tell.
It would. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.